these two speakers. I see Walter is there as well as Robbie. I've known about Southwest Seed for 20 years now, and they're really a remarkable organization in that they really are focused on figuring out natives to our region and how to grow those in enough quantity that they can sell their seeds to people like me who maybe have 5 acres or even just an acre and want some native plants on that. And that's really a kind of unique kind of business. So the fact that their father actually started this business, is that right, Robbie?
Exactly.
Means they've been in it for a long time. And so we're really excited to have them here to present this talk. And I'll just let it go at that, okay?
All right, well, thank you, Darren and Deborah. We appreciate it. This is Walter. His face is kind of in the shadow, so he can look up and get a little closer occasionally. I just hauled him in off the farm today for coming and joining me on this because he really is the knowledgeable one, but I've given a couple of these presentations before. So I'm going to start talking and he might break in and add a little bit more color or information to some of the concepts we're going to talk about. I do want to thank you all for joining us. As everybody said, these are strange times, but all my colleagues in the agriculture world would agree that we've never been more busy. So one of the little silver linings about coronavirus is that people are finding a little bit more time to dedicate to their land and thinking about the projects that they haven't been able to do, and now they can get to them. So I would say that as we're developing this greater appreciation of our lands and what we have in Southwest Colorado, there's a lot to learn about it, and we can't possibly share it all with you right now. But we will try and give some basic ideas and baseline information about the world of native plants and how that may impact you or how that may inform some of your decisions. And then in the second part of the program, we'll talk a little bit more about some specific plants. I hope that there's some new information for people here since you're all master gardeners. I think some of this will be a review, but it doesn't hurt to kind of put it all into perspective and refresh your memory about some of the concepts that do play into decisions that you might make. This is a great time to be thinking about your land and what to do with it for 3 reasons. First of all, soils are starting to warm up now. The temperatures are really good for germination, so timing is just really right. Second, getting out and working on the land is great both for their physical and your mental health right now. And weeds will win if you let them. That old saying about nature abhors a vacuum is really true. So thank you, Gary Larson, for a little perspective there. The things I want us to go through this evening include just a few basic principles about soil health, and then some key concepts about native plants and combining them and components that are really important in understanding as you are looking at some native planting. And then we will go over some native grass plant examples, including some photos. Deb was really wonderful and helped me pull these together since we have been pretty busy. And then we've got a few parting thoughts, and we'll try and leave about 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. So the first thing is basically this idea of living, the principles of soil health. And this actually comes from the principles of cover crops, but they're very good principles and they make a lot of sense in all settings. So the first one is living roots. The best way to help your land remain healthy is to have living roots in it, which translates to have living plants in your soil. And there's a lot of things that the root structure does. It's not just the roots, but that's the base component of what we're talking about. Living roots are always providing food for your microorganisms, the fungi, the bacteria, and other things living in the soil. And that's one of the key components of healthy soil. They're not only a part of that healthy soil, but they're also continuing to create better soil structure, which again does help your soil. It's helping it with water infiltration properties and exudates, which are things that components coming off of the root structure that actually are helping to increase the organic matter in the soil. And I'm sure other people can put that into much better terms, but those living roots and living plants on top of the soil are very good for your soil health. It doesn't always work that way. So in situations where maybe you're making a transition, or people have done new construction and the soil's gotten all torn up, or farmers who are working up a field and need to have some bare soil for a while for weed management, or because the timing's not right for a new crop, then the next principle would be keeping the soil covered if possible. And that means having mulch on top of the surface, leaving the stubble from whatever was growing there before. Anything that helps keep the soil covered helps hold some moisture in the soil, which those microorganisms need for their survival, as well as keeps the soil temperatures a little cooler, which again is good for those living organisms in your soil. A third principle is biodiversity. So the more that you've got going on within your soil, the more different kinds of plants that you have growing, the better off that soil has of attracting a wide variety of microorganisms and different components of the soil, different components of the plant and the microorganisms in the soil, and that again is good for your soils. The final principle would be reducing the disturbances in the soil, and that means that you choose the least destructive or least disturbing mechanisms you possibly can for turning the soil over, getting new seeds incorporated, etc. We went through a big change over time, as this used to be, and many of these principles were the way agriculture was conducted 100 and 200 years ago. Then as we got to more modern agriculture, we kind of began to rely on tools and chemicals and fertilizers and things to grow our crops and grow other things. And now we're kind of recognizing that maybe that was a little too much of a drastic move, and reducing the disturbances of the soil means that you're keeping the soil structure that over time those roots and the microorganisms have helped you create by not just turning them over and digging them up as much as possible. Sometimes it's necessary to use a big plow and really tear up the ground to get old plants out, or to break up hardpan and soil that's become really compacted. If that's not necessary, then don't do that. It's not going to help you your chances of a good establishment of whatever it is you're trying to grow. Well, have you got anything to add to that?
Hi everyone. I'm just kind of piggybacking on Robbie's talk. So I would really stress that we have customers that come in and say, you know, my field's not producing anymore. I'm going to tear it out and start over. And we kind of like to recommend that look at other options before you just completely tear it out. Sometimes it just needs fertilizer, or perhaps maybe just a light tillage to kind of stir it up. It's not always the best to just tear it completely out. Back to you.
Okay, so that's just kind of that quick overview. And like you said, I imagine many of you master gardeners have spent a lot more time focusing on this, but it really is good to remember, because sometimes the principles of soil health don't necessarily correlate with what we're thinking about when we're planting, and they go hand in hand. So moving on to some of these key concepts related to, it's not just the native plant world, but this is a good place to start. One of the key concepts is the difference between annual species and perennial species. And most everybody understands what that means, but not always. And it does help to understand that most annual species have a very shallow root structure. It's one of the reasons that they are so good at being an annual. They don't need to create a huge root structure that can persist for many years. That's why they can grow quickly and move right into seed production. That can be a great thing, especially if you're trying to grow a food crop, or if you're cheatgrass and you want to get a jump on everything else, being an annual really helps you out. Whereas the perennial species typically take at least 2 years to reach full maturity. So that first year, they are really juvenile plants, and they're putting probably more energy into developing their root structure than they are putting into developing that above ground structure. And it takes as much TLC in getting something new established in that first year that you can possibly give it. A lot of times people will come in here and say, well, I can keep my dogs off my new planting for 2 months. And that's really not enough time to allow those plants to get established and really have the root structure they need. So even if they did have some above ground damage, they could continue to persist. Second set of key concepts would be the difference between cool season grasses and warm season grasses. So as the names imply, cool season grasses can start greening up or can cope with much cooler air temperatures and soil temperatures than warm season grasses can. So probably you all have noticed that in March sometimes we'll see a lot of grasses starting to green up already. And those are cool season grasses that are already established. So they're just coming back from their root structure already, and they don't need a lot of warm soil temperatures to continue growing. Cool season grasses, if you're planting new cool season seeds for growth, they definitely need warmer soil temperatures than those established grasses do, but they still don't need the same soil temperatures that warm season grasses do. I can't give you a specific example because all plants have different germination temperatures that they need. But in general, you might consider between 40 degrees and 50 degrees soil temperature as the range that cool season grasses can start germinating in. I know Walter's sitting over here beside me, and I think he'll tell us that there are some species that can green up much earlier than that. But if you just want to kind of have a gross generalization, I would say 40 to 50 degrees.
Yeah, I would agree. And around 60 average day temperature for warm season to germinate warm season grasses.
So that 60-degree temperature, we can never say what a generalization is anymore for our weather around here. But if I were going to generalize, I would say that warm season grasses don't start germinating until probably early June around here. So when we're talking about the soil temperature, we're talking about day and nighttime temperatures averaged over at least a week or so. That's when the soil is actually warming up enough to kind of stay at that temperature. So that's what we're thinking of when we talk about that. Now back to a few more differences. Cool season grasses definitely need some moisture. So most grasses around here we do think of as more drought tolerant, but when we don't have our monsoon rains or there's no supplemental moisture, oftentimes they will go dormant as the summer temperatures heat up and they've already gone to seed. So they can green up again after they've gone dormant, but they will turn brown. Whereas the warm season grasses stay dormant much longer into the season. So they will look dormant until May, even into June. But then once they green up, they pretty much can stay green throughout the summertime. Anything else you'd add on that?
No, keep going.
Okay. Next principle is the difference between sod-forming grasses and bunch grasses. We don't have that many examples of sod-forming grasses in this region, but they're also called rhizomaceous grasses, and that means that once they are mature, so after that second year, they can start to form lateral roots that will come off of the plant and then come up and start new shoots off of that. So it's a wonderful grass if you want your grasses to fill in between bunches of grass or other things. They are wonderful for helping with some weed suppression. They're not perfect at it. No, planting one species is not going to ever suppress all your weeds, but they are very wonderful in kind of helping in that tendency. Whereas a bunch grass, as it sounds, grows in a distinct bunch or clump. And so then it may be taking up a lot more space underground with its root structure, but above ground, it is a very distinctive bunch of grass. Now that is what we have the most species of, are bunch grasses. And oftentimes that's really not a consideration in what you want to plant, unless it's an area where you do need to mow or drive. And then obviously bunch grasses give you a much more uneven surface to be driving on or walking across or something.
I think one grass that you might mention in sod forming is maybe you folks have heard of Garrison creeping foxtail. It's got a terrible name, and it is introduced grass, but it's not a foxtail like the foxtail barley that we fight all the time. This is actually looks like a Timothy head, but in wet areas, it will take over almost all of the rushes, the foxtail barley. It's very aggressive. And it's just a really handy tool. It can also move down the draw and go into your neighbor's field. So there's always considerations.
The next principle or concept are the difference between native and non-native grasses. And I know this is a talk about native grasses, and a lot of people have a real interest in what our natives are around here and how to get them established. We take a kind of, I'm going to say a classical view. That's probably not the right term to use, but for us at Southwest Seed, we think of native grasses as those species that were here before white folks arrived in the area and started bringing with them introduced grasses from other countries. Down at the bottom, we'll get back to this concept a little bit when we talk about the spectrum of what native actually means. But right now, the difference between a native species is something that was growing here originally versus something that has been introduced, which is what a non-native is. So non-natives are not necessarily bad grasses in any way, and they have a real role to play in many of the needs we have for growing things. But it is important to understand that difference. There is a huge price difference between most natives and non-natives. Natives have not been bred and tinkered with a whole bunch for growth tendencies and easy germination and things that a lot of our pasture grasses and some of the other really important species have been bred for. So we don't have as much predictability with the native grasses like we do with a lot of the non-native grasses. Drought tolerance or water needs. Really, my comment about this is, as you go online and do research or read your books and things about different species and how drought tolerant they are, this very, very loose concept comes up all the time. Oh, it is drought tolerant. It is not drought tolerant. But they really don't, the people who write these articles, even us at Southwest Seed, don't put that into context very often. So drought tolerant in Michigan or in Florida is a very different concept from drought tolerant in Southwest Colorado. So it's a really useful concept to explore a little bit deeper and try and get much more specific about the annual precip necessary or the, how much water drought tolerant actually means for something you might be looking at. Then moving on to early cereal workhorses. That's kind of a wonk term, the early cereal, but what it means is that there are some pioneer species or grasses that can do well besides weeds, because weeds tend to always be these pioneer grasses. They love a disturbed area, but there are a few native grasses that do very well in disturbed soil or as the first species that really gets established and kind of holds space for natives that you want to take over in a planting that you're working on. So two of the key early cereal workhorses are slender wheatgrass and mountain brome. There are some other ones also like bottlebrush, squirreltail, and needle and threadgrass, and I think we've got an example of each of those coming up. But those are great grasses to have as a component of some kind of a reclamation plan or other planting that you might be considering, because they do take that early jump in there and get established role. And then oftentimes they will fade. They're not that long lived, but they have been there long enough so other grasses can get established. And that last concept then is the spectrum of native. And this is an interesting concept without a lot of, science isn't quite the right word to use, but there's a lot of different ideas and definitions behind it. So I gave you our definition of a native, which is a species that was growing here. And by here, I'm actually talking about in North America, before white folks started arriving and introducing other species. But native can be drilled down to something that came from, the seed was collected here in Montezuma County or in La Plata County and grown out here, so that we're doing our best to preserve the genetics of that, not only that species, but the genetics of that species growing right here, because soils are different, altitude is different, maybe the amount of precipitation is different. And so that's kind of the most specialized definition of native. And then it can move along that spectrum up to this idea of a species that was growing here. Now, within a species, you can have a lot of varieties. So that means, let's talk about Indian ricegrass. That's an easy one, and a lot of you probably know Indian ricegrass. Indian ricegrass is a native grass, and it's grown all over the United States. There are some varieties that have been developed by some of our research centers. And so they have taken genetic material from specific places and worked with that to try and improve upon germination, seed yield, maybe resistance to certain insects or things that actually cause a lot of problems. So those varieties may come from different parts of the country, but they have the tendency to do the best in terms of growing them out and actually getting them established. Whereas locally genetic material may have all of the genetics of something that you really want, but it hasn't been bred to necessarily be the easiest to get to germinate and to get established. So that's what I'm talking about when I look at that spectrum of native. It's important to understand that different people have a different concept of what native means. Southwest Seed does not just try and grow locally collected, local ecotypes of natives. We find that for most of our business, those varieties that have some predictability are much, much more widespread in their applicability.
I think I would add also, Robbie, that when you say the researchers work with these plants, they're not doing any kind of plant breeding. It's a selection process, so nothing is being changed. They're just taking, say, the tallest plants and the plants that have the best germination, as Robbie pointed out, and grouping those together and trying to weed out the weaker plants. So certainly no modifications are going on. Or just a quick example of a local ecotype of Western wheatgrass we were asked to grow, and we did. We grew about 15 acres of it. It germinated great. It spread. It was very rhizomaceous. It didn't make seed though. It made maybe 20 pounds per acre, and with the release variety, we're expecting 500 pounds an acre. So that's the problem that we found with these local ecotypes. With no background on them and no history, we really don't know what to expect. And that's what makes it a crapshoot.
So anyhow, those are some basic key concepts. I hope you all are jotting down questions or thoughts about this, then we can get back to that. But we're going to move on now just to an overview of some of the grasses that are maybe typify some of those concepts that we just looked at, but also that are typically found around here. So I'm going to let Walter do a little talking now.
All right. Well, annual species, cheatgrass. I'm sure you all fight this constantly. And we've got another one moving in called hair barley that's becoming kind of a problem for us also. But as Robbie said, cheatgrass grows incredibly fast. It's already headed out and it's going to make seed. If you chopped all the tops off of that cheatgrass, it would still make seed. Whereas the perennial Indian ricegrass Robbie's got on the right there, as she stated earlier, we plant this at the farm. We baby it for the first year. We irrigate, fertilize, and hope for seed production the second year, which kind of correlates with what Robbie was saying with just the time it takes for a perennial plant to get established and start growing. I'm not sure exactly how you want to proceed on this. Oh, cool season versus warm season. So Robbie basically filled you in on cool seasons are going to be green most of the winter. Mutton grass, we just are going to come up and look at in a moment, has already headed out. It's green all winter long. We have a field of this out at our farm. The elk live on it. Whereas the warm season grasses are dormant until, ours have greened up about 2 weeks ago. We burn them off to make that black kind of a heat substrate and just warm them up a little bit earlier. I'm not sure. Let's continue on. So Robbie had mentioned needle and thread grass. It is a cereal crop. It germinates fairly rapidly. It's got a very interesting planting technique. If you've ever looked at the seed, we call it spear grass. There's a twist in the awn and a crook in the awn so that when moisture hits it, it'll auger itself into the ground and help plant itself. Very cool seed. However, when we clean it, we knock the awn off, so that leaves it up to you, the landowner, to put it into the ground.
If you've ever gone out and looked at this stuff, it's beautiful grass when it's starting to head out. It all of the seeds and the awns kind of lean in the same direction, and it's really lovely. As soon as that seed starts to actually mature and dry out a little bit, the needle and thread is a very, very accurate description. If you try and collect that seed, you will need heavy duty leather gloves, and you will still pierce your skin. But it is a great native grass. It is pretty. You don't want to put your animals on it though. So that's one of those factors to be aware of. Same thing with the bottlebrush squirreltail. Once that seed starts to mature and dry out a little bit, it's more of a hazard for pets and livestock than it is a help.
Prior to the seed production, though, it's a good feed for livestock and wild animals. All right, so blue grama. Sod-forming grasses can be rhizomaceous or stoloniferous. Buffalo grass is one that we use quite often here that is like a strawberry. It has an above-ground root that can spread over the surface of the ground, which is very cool. However, in your gardens, when you put down a little barrier, thinking that it will stop the roots from growing through it, it will jump the barrier and continue on its own merry way. And blue grama is a slow sod former. It's not really active rhizomaciously compared to, say, western wheatgrass or Kentucky bluegrass. Cool season grasses. And Robbie's got mutton grass pulled up here. This is a very cool little native that we've got growing all around our country here in the pinyon juniper area. Like I said earlier, it is headed out now. It's one of the earliest grasses to head out. It actually is ahead of the cheatgrass. When you're walking in the PJ, you will see small tufts of this grass. It probably gets maybe 6 inches around, and it is got a bluegrass leaf. It looks just like a golf course, but it is a true bunch grass, and it's a beautiful little grass.
And as Walt said, the elk love it. They will dig down through the snow to find this grass and eat it on the farm. This is just an example of wheat grasses. There's about at least 13 different species of wheat grasses, which is frustrating because not only is there wheat, but then there are wheat grasses and 13 different types, and they all have different characteristics and things, but most of them are found around here. A few of them are introduced species, but most of them are native grasses. And they can be a really beautiful and important addition to a lot of different reclamation and native type grass plantings. One of the ones Walt mentioned already was western wheatgrass, which is a very rhizomaceous grass. So it does spread, and it's got a light bluish cast to it. So it's a very distinctive grass also. Another one that many people would be familiar with is crested wheatgrass, because it got used in the early days of the CRP, or the Conservation Reserve Program. And so it's probably one of our most drought tolerant grasses. It's nothing that beautiful, but if erosion control or just holding soil in place is one of your key factors in a very dry area, it is worth considering.
June grass, another cool season, bunch grass. Robbie's already got that written down. Another beautiful little grass. This grows typically in the same region in the PJ as well as up into the ponderosa forests in our country here. You can find it headed out fairly early in the year, probably I would say in June, it would have full seed heads on it. And off to the right, you can kind of see a picture. The seed heads are very light, fluffy, very pretty grass. And there's nothing really bad to say about it. It's not real aggressive. So if you put it out in a stand by itself, and we've grown it at the farm, we end up having to do a lot of hand hoeing because it won't compete against other grasses that are there.
Sandberg bluegrass. So we've got over 3 bluegrasses that are all natives, the mutton grass, the June grass, and now the Sandberg bluegrass. And all 3 of these are early green ups. I kind of think of them as our understory grasses. They don't tend to get that big. They green up pretty early, but they do fill in that lower level of typical planting where you might have several different heights and different maturation times and things like that. So all 3 of these are really good grasses for our region around here.
And just for clarification, June grass is not a bluegrass.
Excuse me.
Thanks for doing that. Arizona fescue, I'd say this about most grasses, but it's a beautiful grass. We don't have it really native around here too much. When you get up into the higher country around here, we usually see Thurber needlegrass, Thurber fescue. Around Flagstaff, there's lots of Arizona fescue. However, we've grown it at the farm. It does wonderful here. Very, very fine leaves that tend to kind of droop over and kind of make a little fountain look, if you will. I'd recommend it in a landscape garden, something you wouldn't mow it. You'd want it to let it grow out and just be decorative.
Idaho fescue. Now, I actually think the one on the left might not be an Idaho fescue.
It might be sheep, but I couldn't prove it.
I think it might be a sheep fescue, but it would be hard to tell. Couple of things to see about this. So you're seeing a couple of examples of fescues, and they do tend to have very, very distinct bunches, and they do have very fine leaves. And so this is that trip hazard I mentioned when you're talking about some of the bunch grasses. But these are a very fine leafed, wispy almost looking plant. They're really very nice. And if you do choose something like this in an area that needs to be manicured a little bit, you can tell that one mowing, you would get rid of those tall seed heads and still have a pretty nice below the seed head leaf structure. So they make very nice ornamental grasses also. The one on the right-hand side, I do believe, is an Idaho fescue, and it's a slightly higher altitude grass. Does very well around here also.
Very drought tolerant.
Here's that bottlebrush squirreltail I mentioned earlier. It's a neat grass. You do see it in very droughty areas. I believe it does okay. Now, nothing does, you can say something is drought tolerant, you know, it only needs 6 inches of precipitation, but it really depends on when you get that precipitation. And the germination process is one of the most key times. You need to have, all seed needs to be in the presence of moisture long enough to germinate and get established. So that's really key. So once bottlebrush gets established, it can do very well on very little moisture. You can see with that picture on the right-hand side what those needles or those barbs and awns look like once they do start to dry out, and why that does get in pets' fur and in their paws and in their mouths and eyes and things like that.
Right. But once again, beautiful grass. We've grown this out at the farm, and we would cut it and put it in windrows. And the windrows would be maybe 18 inches tall when we cut them. And then as it dried and the awns open up, the windrows would get 3 feet tall. And then when the wind blew, we would have bottlebrush everywhere. Tidbits.
We're going to speed up a little bit so that we can get through the rest of our slides and then give you all a chance to ask some questions. Moving on to the warm season grasses.
Galleta is a slightly rhizomaceous grass, kind of a brawny grass. It's one of the ones that you see more often when you're hiking out in the ground that's been overgrazed, because it's not real palatable either. Let's go to the next.
It's also known as curly grass, and it's a very drought tolerant grass.
Little blue stem, which has been kind of introduced to this side of the state. It's a native from eastern Colorado and back into Oklahoma, Texas area. You can see it growing on the side of the roads. It's purple in the fall. Very pretty grass. Does very well here, but likes a little more moisture than most of our dryland areas. Blue wild rye is actually a cool season grass. Probably just keeping me on my toes. Higher elevation, this would be growing up around 85 to 10,000 feet probably, and very common up in the high country.
Yeah, there's several different wild ryegrasses like this that you would find in that zone.
Mountain brome, as Robbie said earlier, this is an early cereal plant, easy to germinate, easy to get to grow, fairly inexpensive, native bunch grass, very common in the higher elevations.
We threw in just a couple of shrubs because they can be really important and beautiful depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So first of all, four-winged saltbush is probably one of the most common, besides sage, one of the most common shrubs that we see around here. And animals really do like to browse it, especially in the wintertime. So depending on what your objectives are with your planting, this is a good one to know about.
Antelope bitterbrush, once again, very common out in the pinyon juniper in our country here. Can be confused with cliff rose sometimes. I think it's the flower that is different, but it's just a very typical native drought tolerant shrub. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
So that wraps up just some of the species that we were going to share with you. I did want to, I hope you can lean in close and look at this. So I didn't really appreciate what we had with seeds until I started putting it all together like this. And you can kind of see a comparison of so many different kinds of seeds. And not only are the plants beautiful, but the seeds themselves are pretty miraculous. So I just like this. I guess I added it for my own entertainment.
Are we ready for questions?
Not quite, almost.
Pardon me.
One last concept I wanted to share with you all is just planting rates. It's a very difficult concept for a couple of reasons. It's hard to get seeds scattered in kind of the appropriate rates. I'm sure many of you have done vegetable gardens and you know how much thinning you have to do when something really establishes well and you've got a huge overseeding going on. So I wanted just to show probably 40 seeds per square foot is the lowest planting rates that we would normally see. And so that is a square foot that you're looking at. And that is, I can't swear I exactly counted 40, but that's about what 40 seeds per square foot looks like. And you can imagine, you saw like what one of those bunches of grass, perhaps one of the bottlebrush squirrel tails looks like. And if that were growing in the center of that square foot, it would pretty much take up the whole area there. So you can tell if you can get enough seed germinated, you don't need a lot of seed. However, that's the key, is getting the seed to germinate. And I don't have any numbers for this, but I would imagine that in nature, 1 in every 1,000 or every 10,000 seeds actually lands where it can be covered with soil, get enough moisture, and actually germinate. It's really kind of a crapshoot who actually gets to start growing and survive. In plantings that we actually plant and strive for, it's still not a done deal, even when you can give the moisture and your timing and everything is just right. You still don't get full germination. And I've read about people who are, doing scientific research on getting a particular seed germinated in a nursery. So they're working with every factor they possibly can, and they still may only have a 60% germination. And that's considered really, really great. So this is just a way of helping you understand kind of what a typical seeding should look like or could look like. So this is more like 300 seeds per square foot, and this is far more typical because it plays to our psychology, where we're scattering seed, we can't see it once it hits the soil, and it just doesn't feel like there's enough seed there. And there's nothing wrong with it. There's kind of a sweet spot between being as frugal as possible and just throwing the seed on the ground and wasting the seed. But I thought that was just a good way of kind of illustrating what it looks like when you actually are getting down to getting seed on the ground. So that's my last slide for the moment. So we could open this up to questions and comments.
Hey, Robbie, this is Darren. So I'm just going to ask you to, can you unshare your screen?
I can.
Perfect. You did it on the first try, better than me. Okay, so I'm just gonna let you know. So we did have a question, some chat here. In terms of chat box, so the first question came from Deb, just wondering if 6 weeks fescue is a cool season native annual could be used to compete with cheatgrass. You guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Darren, we've been working with, we've been growing 6 weeks fescue out at the farm for about 5 years now. And it's acting more like a fall annual or a winter annual. So it is the same growth habit as cheatgrass, but I do not believe that it would compete against cheatgrass. It's just not a buff enough grass. It's very small. Cheatgrass explodes around it and kind of dominates it. So I'm not convinced that it would compete with, it will compete with cheatgrass, but it won't overtake or suppress cheatgrass.
Okay. And then we had another question. Some folks have been doing probably some fire mitigation or some forest thinning of a ponderosa forest. And now that they've obviously introduced a lot more sunlight into the ground, or the potential growing spaces, is there a certain type of grass that you would recommend that could potentially do okay in kind of that forest flourish of an older ponderosa, situation?
Yeah. So Western wheatgrass is one that we talked about earlier. And while it's not necessarily considered a pioneer species, because it is rhizomaceous and spreading, it is an excellent grass to try and get growing in a lot of places. It's got a pretty wide range, both in terms of altitude and in terms of how much sunlight it can handle. So I would say that that would be an excellent one to explore. A couple of other ones, depending on altitude, Indian ricegrass, and I say Indian ricegrass not necessarily because it has a special characteristic, but as we find that has a pretty wide range of places that it can grow and does grow pretty well.
I would toss in your mountain brome and slender as well, because big seeds, they'll grow quickly. I may be pretty acidic under those ponderosas, I'm not sure, but the seed, as we say, if you leave it in the bag, you got no chance at all.
Can I ask a question, Robbie,
Sure.
on that one? We have a lot of luck with Arizona fescue here at 6,700 feet. We're right on the Ponderosa edge, and I think Melanie's up a little higher. I'm pretty sure she would have success with Arizona fescue, and I'm also wondering about Muhlenbergia montana, if that would work for her.
I think you're right, Deb. Both of those would work. June grass would be another one that would probably do really well there. The mountain muley or Muhlenbergia montanus is not available right now, but if you collected your own seed, then it would work fine.
Most of the species that we looked at today has the potential to grow there. So we talked about diversity being a really good thing, but sometimes those pioneer species can swamp some of the other things that can get going. And, you've seen when we have a super bloom or a real great growth year because we had spring moisture, that's what will happen in your plantings or in nature anyhow, is that some things will grow, they're just strong enough and their germination capacity is strong enough to really get going in pretty harsh conditions. In a lot of other cases, you plant that seed and you may not see anything happening for 3 years just because the conditions aren't right. And if you don't have supplemental moisture, or the moisture comes at the wrong time or something, the seed's just going to have to hang out and wait for a better time.
This next kind of set of questions here, I feel like they kind of all go together. One indicates, what is the best time of year for planting? And I'm assuming, let's just go ahead and focus maybe on the cool season grasses. So kind of like, what is the best time of year? And then, if you don't have a drill or access to a drill, can you broadcast seed? And then how do you cover? And then the depth. So maybe if you guys could just walk through it, because I'm sure you're getting a lot of these questions now, because I am getting a lot of these questions now, is when should I plant these grasses? I got some irrigated pasture mix or dryland pasture mix. When do I plant and how do I do it? So maybe, and I think it's really important for folks, because we see a lot of failure with getting the seed out, timing, placement, cover, fertilizer, all those things. So if you guys wouldn't mind just walking us through kind of those steps for planting a cool season grass, that would be awesome.
Okay. Well, you mentioned irrigation, and that really frees you up to plant whenever you have irrigation. I'm going to lean more towards a dryland planting. With cool seasons, I don't recommend planting right now. We're getting close to June, which is typically dry and windy, hot. I like to plant in the fall. My cool season grasses out at the farm, pardon me, we do. If not in the fall, then look at the monsoonal periods, perhaps the 1st of June, if you can see a good monsoonal flow. You just need water and heat. And right now, all we've got is the heat. So yes, if you can drill it, that's the best. The idea is to put the seed in the soil about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. Seed size is what dictates how deep you can plant it. The smaller the seed, the shallower you plant it. If you're drilling it, you can set the seed at the depth you want. If you're broadcasting it, you're just tossing it out on the surface. You really can help yourself out by dragging something across it, an old gate, a rake. It depends on how big your area is. Robbie's going to probably talk about some kind of cover for that, straw, sawdust, anything to keep the moisture around the seed for as long as possible.
So yeah, since you've only got that 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 inch of soil covering the seed, that's the zone that dries out the quickest also. So anything and everything you can do to hold moisture, help that seed contain moisture around it, is what's going to dictate its success. In general, you can think that seeds take somewhere between 10 days and 30 days to germinate. Each seed, each species is different, but that's kind of the typical range. But before you actually see germination, the seed is doing a lot of work to germinate. So it wants to be in the presence of moisture. And that just means that it doesn't get moisture and it's starting to do its processes, and then it goes bone dry. Bone dry is the death knell for a grass that is starting to germinate. So again, if you've got a lot of seed down, then you lose some to, that lack of moisture. That's not such a, at least you've got some backup seed there in the soil. So anything you can do, if you do have, when Western Excelsior had its plant here, you could get their reject Excelsior blankets, and that's a great way to hold extra moisture in your soil. If it's a small area, if you're dealing with several acres, you're not going to put erosion control blankets down on everything. Straw can be a good tool, but if you can't incorporate it into the soil a little bit, throw a little dirt on top of it, the first windy day that we have, you're going to blow your straw down to your neighbor's house. And straw can be problematic because oftentimes there are still seed heads in that straw. If it's just wheat straw or something and you get a little wheat growing, that's not such a big deal. But you get whatever the farmer had that grew that hay or that straw, and oftentimes that will include weeds also. So if you see a flush of things besides what you planted, it may be related to that straw that you put down. If you are chipping because you're doing some fire mitigation, etc., those wood chips are an excellent way to help hold some of the moisture on the soil. But you still need the soil coverage. The mulch does not pass for that soil coverage. The seeds need that. The soil is close enough contact with the seed that it can hold moisture and the warm temperatures close to the seed. It's not so porous that it can just, pass off in the evening or without water.
So Walt, you mentioned the fall plantings. Are you doing that as a dormant fall planting, or are you doing that before and expecting some germination and growth before our hard freezes and dormant season come?
Typically, Darren, we're doing a dormant planting. We'll plant in November with the idea that we don't want it to germinate until the first thing in the spring when the soil warms up and we have hopefully a little moisture. And we do that especially with forbs, penstemons, and just wildflowers, because there's such a high dormancy in the seed that it takes the freezing and thawing and the moisture to break the seed coat down. A lot of the grasses don't have as high a dormancy, and you can plant them. You have more windows to plant them. How's that?
And I think you probably see that if you guys just, as you drive around the county and you see farmers out there in November, know that that's what they're probably doing. It seems like when they're trying to overseed or put some new seed down, they do it. And if they can get it right before that storm comes in, that's an ideal situation. So I think all of us as gardeners and land and homeowners, you need to recognize that too, is, a fall is going to be an ideal time. And if you just take this spring, for an example, it's been 80 degrees now in many of our locations for well over a week, and winds dry out that soil surface. And it's been a kind of a brutal spring, I would think, to try to get something to germinate. So that fall planting, I think, is a great idea.
Well, and it mimics nature pretty well also. Most plants go to seed heads in the summer and moving towards the fall, and that's when they drop off. So then those seeds are just lying on the ground waiting for the right conditions, and that often comes in the springtime.
And then what do you guys recommend? One of the questions here was about fertilizing. Do you do a fertilizer at planting? Do you let it go for a year? Could you come back in later and do a fertilizer? What do you recommend folks to do?
We're out at the farm where we're irrigating, say, just take western wheatgrass, we'll do an application of about 100 units of nitrogen in the fall, and then maybe 50 units in the spring, or 75 in the fall, 50 in the spring. In the fall, we're trying to encourage tillering for seed production. And in the spring, we put the fertilizer down just for general health of the plant. And it's mostly nitrogen and a little phosphate.
Talk about a new planting though. When would you put fertilizer down?
I typically do not put fertilizer down with the seed. I will let the plant germinate, get started, maybe have 5 leaves, 6, 7 leaves, and then put a light dose of fertilizer, maybe 20 pounds of nitrogen and a little phosphate down. I've found that usually the weeds get the fertilizer if I put it down when I'm planting, and they do really well with it. Does that answer the question, Darren?
Yeah, that's awesome. And then we have about maybe just time for maybe a couple more questions. And one was just regarding, you had the shrubs, like the 4-wing. Do you guys sell that as seed or as plants? How do you guys sell that?
We sell that as seeds. We're not a nursery. In no way do we have seedlings. That would be a whole new set of warehouses and knowledge. So I think some of those shrubs you can find at some nurseries. So, if it's a very specific planting, I bet you could find them already started and get yourself way ahead of the curve. They are an exercise in patience. They are a much, much bigger growth happening before you actually start to see much in terms of a true shrub. So typically you don't put a lot of shrubs into a mix. Now, in some cases that was the dominant species before, the land got disturbed in some way, or that may be an objective. Perhaps you want wildlife coverage or something, and so you do want a lot of shrubs to get going, but that's not a typical strategy. And so you don't put that many shrubs in and then focus on the grasses and be surprised when you do see some shrubs actually starting.
And then my last question is, Southwest Seed is, it's been down here in this little corner of the world for decades. So if people want to buy your seed or buy, your stuff, where can they get it?
So we do sell quite a bit of seed to both Native Roots and Durango Nursery over in Durango. So, if that's what you've got easy access to, they will be able to help you out for quite a few things. They can do special orders. You can also order directly from us. We do ship, or you can come and visit us. Now with coronavirus on, we have a curbside model. So we run out and do all the work for you. We have pretty lightweight minimum. So 1 pound of straight seed and 1/4 pound of the wildflowers are our minimums. Other than that, you can call us up. We'll help you kind of try and figure out what grouping of species you might want, if you want to mix, or how much you need of whatever you're looking at. And we can do custom mixes. So that's kind of one of the things we think of as our specialty, because we do work with these native grasses. We can help you kind of combine things to what might be most specific to your objectives.
That's excellent. And they do have a great website too. So southwestseed.com, if I'm not mistaken, that's your guys' website.
Yep, pretty simple.
You guys have kind of redone it in the last year or so, and it's a good description. I love how you give that nice description of all your mixes. So it's, again, if you guys want to check out a good website, even just as an educational resource, check out their website at Southwest Seed. Anybody else have a question? We're kind of run up here about 7:30, and we'll respect time, but anybody have a question that they can just go ahead and unmute themselves and ask?
All right.
Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Hope this did give you something new to think about or to work with. And you're welcome to call us or check out that website, and we'll see what we can help you with.
Thank
Okay,
you
I
so
want to
much.
thank you guys. I want to thank you both, Robbie and Walt. You guys have been supporters of Extension for a long time throughout Southwest Colorado, and also the University Research Station over there in Yellow Jacket. So we truly value your partnership and your knowledge, and for you guys staying out at the farm here till 7:30. So thanks for that.
You're welcome,
Big
everybody.
props. Yeah.
Thank you, Lyle. Thanks,
All
Dan.
right.
Thanks.
The Grange thanks you too. Thank you.
We appreciate all of you. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Be
Bye-bye.
safe.